Chapter 22 of the Alps, the Danube, and the Near East. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Read by Betty B. Peasant Maids and Patchwork Farms. This morning we have left the blazing white capital of Yugoslavia, have driven past the trenches where the Serbians lay when Belgrade was bombarded, and are now out in the country. Automobiles are few, and the horses and the oxen pulling the rude farm carts of the country grow frightened and jump this way and that as we pass by. An occasional motor truck crowds us almost off the roadway, and now and then a lot of building material on its way to make the new Serbia brings us to a stop. For instance, the steel rails for the railroad under construction near Belgrade are being hauled over these rough, narrow roads by oxen. The load for each team consists of 3 rails weighing 70 pounds to the yard, laid on the trucks of a farm wagon, the fore and the hind wheels of which are perhaps 30 feet apart. The peasants tramping along move slowly out of our way. They are queer-looking people, sturdy and stolid, independent and self-reliant. They are dressed in homespun, and both men and women wear the brightest colors. A man may have a jacket under which shows a vest of red, yellow, and blue, woven in stripes or patterns, and his stockings of brown are sometimes a mass of embroidery. The women wear different colored cloths about their heads, and often have on long white coats decorated with gay colors and peppered with tinsel spangles. Their skirts are striped in bright red, blue, and other colors, and below them show substantial legs encased in red stockings embroidered like those of the men. Both men and women wear opantsis, homemade shoes with boot-like soles turning up at the toes and bound on with straps weaving round the legs halfway to the knees. This footgear seems very comfortable. The more picturesque crowds are generally made up of village groups on their way to the city, for the people wear less striking clothing at their farm work. As we ride, we take notes of the farms, stopping now and then to watch a gang of women and men at work in the fields, or to make snapshots of the boat-like homemade farm vehicles as they jolt over the roads. This agricultural area is different from that of Hungary, with its huge estates and its tiny ribbon-like farms. Here in Serbia, most of the farms are mere garden patches. Some are squares, others triangles, and now and then a wide band of land surrounds a square that belongs to another owner. Sometimes the patches will form curves as they follow the slope of a hill. The whole reminds one of a picture puzzle. At present, 85% of the population of the Kingdom of the Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes is engaged in farming, stock breeding, and fruit growing. The people pride themselves on belonging to the land. Nearly every family is a landholder, and a man will do anything rather than part with his farm. The homestead law provides that even if a man becomes bankrupt, he can retain debt-free 5 acres, a pair of oxen, a plow, and his agricultural tools. Another statute that helps the small farmer is an old law requiring every landowner to contribute a part of his corn or wheat to a municipal store, from which supplies are lent to the peasants if they need grain for the next planting. A third helpful institution is the village custom of turning out in a body to aid the poor man in cutting his corn and bringing in his harvest. Yugoslavia claims to be first on the continent in raising corn, 5th in growing wheat, and 9th in its crops of rye. It is next to the United States in the production of corn and ranks 7th among the lands of the world in oats, 10th in barley, and 9th in potatoes. It produces also beet sugar, raw silk, and tobacco. The lands along the Adriatic have almost as many vineyards as those of the Rhine. There are orchards everywhere yielding apples, pears, peaches, and plums. It is the paradise of little Jack Horner, for there are more than 20 plum trees for every family in the kingdom, and the average yield of each tree is about 30 pounds. I have looked at some of the fruit in the markets of Belgrade. It is abundant and of every variety, but it is speckled and spotted and shows evidence of lack of spraying and scientific culture. The new government is trying to improve this condition and has established experimental farms and faculties for agriculture at the universities at Zagreb and Belgrade, and there are also 3 agricultural colleges and 9 agricultural schools. Since there are no fences in Serbia, the stock grazing in the fields has to be watched. In our motor trip, we see cow maids, sheep maids, and even pig maids herding 2 or 3 animals on small patches of grass surrounded by grain. Some of the stock feeds on the stubble of the grain fields, not daring to touch the unthreshed shocks of wheat, rye, barley, or oats under their noses. Much of the herding is done by old women or very young children. I have taken many pictures of the little ones watching the flocks. The villages here are different from those of the European countries I have recently visited. Most of the towns of Germany, Switzerland, France, and the other lands of Northern Europe consist of houses close to the streets without large yards or gardens. Here the villages are made up of little enclosures, each containing its own group of buildings with fruit trees and gardens about them. The typical holding contains a hut, a haystack, a banked-over cave-like cellar, and a granary. The houses are mean as a rule. Each village has its schoolhouse, and in one that I visited last week, I found a teacher writing the text of a French lesson on a blackboard for a half-dozen barefooted boys and girls. The percentage of literacy throughout the kingdom is small. In the old kingdom of Serbia, in Montenegro, and in the parts of the country that did not belong to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a large proportion of the people cannot read and write. But new schools are being started, and the government has a big educational program. The Minister of Foreign Affairs tells me that since the Kingdom of Yugoslavia was formed, the college students have increased in number from 2,000 to 12,000, and that universities at Belgrade, Zagreb, and Ljubljana are all thriving. The University of Belgrade has about 8,000 students, whereas before the war it had only 1,500. The Zagreb University has more than 3,000, and the one at Ljubljana has about 1,000. The latter did not even exist before 1920. In the parts of Yugoslavia taken from Austria-Hungary, the educational facilities are better than in the old Serbia. The Austrians established many public schools and all kinds of academies and colleges. Under their regime, the young men went to Budapest or Vienna for their higher education. It is hoped they will now come to Belgrade. The Hungarians are better farmers than the Serbs, the Croats or the Slovenes, and the parts of the new kingdom taken from Hungary are much better tilled than the lands through which I have recently motored. The great contrast is seen as soon as one crosses the Save River. In old Serbia, the division of the land into small tracts makes the use of agricultural machinery less practicable than where the farms are bigger. The yield of grain is lower than in the areas belonging to Hungary, and the rolling nature of the region makes for greater waste. Here and there are signs of earth washing, which might be controlled by more scientific cultivation. Some of the best lands of Hungary were given to Serbia, and there is no richer tract in the world than that along the Danube between the new frontier and Belgrade. The moment I went over the new boundary line on the train, I could see a difference in prosperity. In the present Hungary there are but few new buildings. That land was ruined by the war and by the fall of exchange. It has no money for repairs, and the towns and the cities are shabby. But crossing into Yugoslavia, I noticed the red tiles of new roofs standing out everywhere on the landscape. There was more activity about the stations. There were new cars on the railways, and the locomotives seemed to burn better coal. At every crossroads, wagons loaded with hogs, hay, or grain were waiting for the train to pass, and the shocks of wheat and oats peppering the landscape showed the natural wealth of the new kingdom. There is current throughout the valley of the Danube a superstition that the harvest will not prosper unless the sheaves are shocked in the form of a cross. Accordingly, they are not stood on end and capped as with us, but are stacked up so that every pile is an emblem of the crucifix on which our Savior died. The heads of the sheaves come together at the center, meeting there in 4 piles, 3 sheaves to each pile, and making a perfect Greek cross. Rye, oats, and barley are shocked in the same way. In Hungary, the population is Roman Catholic, and the shocks there seem to me to look more like the Roman cross. In Yugoslavia, we also saw more and more livestock. It was strange to see hogs that grew wool, but I saw several droves of these animals with such curly hair that were it not for their noses, they might have been sheep. Their tails were, however, more like those of horses, having long curling hairs so numerous that one would make a good fly brush. The breed is one well known here, and it might be a good thing to introduce it into America. End of chapter 22.